Good morning. My name is Nancy Pedulla. My husband Albert and I have been parishioners here for about 30 years. I serve InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in my day job as Vice President for the Learning and Talent Department, and I'd be remiss to not take this moment to thank you as a congregation again for the ways that you invest in our leadership through Jason and Sophia Gabry, Carolyn Carney, and myself as we serve students and faculty. I'm very glad to be in the sanctuary this morning. I have been on a long journey with All Angels, and it's good to be in a place where we've met God together. As I'm standing here, it's easy to imagine where most of you would be sitting if you were in this room. Almross would be over here close to the door with their 4 kids so they can manage if someone goes rogue. Paul Johnson would be over here. Mary would be here so she can join him for communion. Fumi would be somewhere around there, and Albert and I would be over here trying to make sure not too much sunlight was in our faces. For me, as I step in here every week, there are lots of people in this room who've sat in these seats who've gone to be elsewhere. Scott and Kathy Twan McLean in Baltimore. I think about the Lobig Giles, who sat over there and are now in San Francisco. Think about Jack Flannery, who's sitting next to the Lord, along with many others, who shared a journey here with us. For me, too, this room is full of moments, and those moments are flashes in my journey with God. I remember where I sat when each of my children were baptized. I remember being there just 2 years ago when Eric Aldifer washed my feet on the Holy Thursday service. I remember where I stood for healing prayer at critical moments with many of you who prayed things that stick in my life now. So I look forward to the time when we can be here again. And as we tune into Sarah's story, she too has been on a long journey with God by the time she gets to today's passage. She too has places that have cemented her. So today we will look first at the journey of Sarah from Genesis 12 through 17 and what's happened, and then we'll tune into the passage for today, and then we'll think some about how Sarah's story might cause us to ask questions about our own. When we meet Sarah, she has already departed from her family and left her homeland because of her marriage to Abraham. She's moved to Haran with her husband's extended family, and the first thing we learn about Sarah is that she is barren. She lives in a patriarchal culture where wealth is passed through sons. The failure to produce an heir is a family calamity, since it means that the parents may, in fact, be impoverished, and their offspring as well. In her culture, her identity and status as a woman is connected to her ability to be fertile. In Genesis 12 and 15 and 17, God meets with Abraham and makes a set of covenant promises to him. In those promises, Abram's told he will be a father of a great nation. He will inherit the land. He will have the Lord with him. He will be an extender of blessing to others. 3 times the Lord meets with Abraham and makes these promises. And in Genesis 12, Abraham is invited to take his family and to head off from Haran toward Canaan, relinquishing his family land, relinquishing his family inheritance, and trusting in the Lord to provide those promises. And so Sarah leaves again. She leaves with a wealthy family. Abraham's traveling with livestock, other family members, household members. She leaves behind for a difficult journey, and she leaves as the wife of the leader of a small traveling village. One of the first snapshots we see of Sarah, it happens when Abraham and Sarah encounter a famine. They enter into Egypt, where it will be easier to get food. And as they enter, Abraham's entourage is entering a space where Abraham's power is not that of the greatest cultural control. Sarah is a beautiful woman. She's older, in her 60s, and the word for beautiful that's used for her might be a word that suggests she has value, perhaps that of a lovely cow. Abraham feels vulnerable. He takes the situation into his own hands. He treats Sarah as an object and not a wife. He says to her, "Say that you are my sister, so that it will go well for me." Because of what he does, Sarah is made vulnerable and taken out of her household and placed into the bed of a stranger. She becomes a concubine to the Pharaoh. She's placed as a sexual object into someone else's hands to protect a powerful man whose power is less in this situation. God has already promised to bless Abraham, already called him to a future, already placed him on a journey. Abraham's fear causes him to act, wresting power from God into his own arms. Because of Sarah's gift to Pharaoh, Abraham gets some extra livestock and cattle. He becomes wealthier, but God is displeased and judges Pharaoh, sending plagues upon him and his household. And Pharaoh thrusts Sarah and Abraham out, sending them back into their journey, displeased because they have not told the truth. Through all this, we do not hear Sarah's voice once. She is revealed to us only as an object, not as an actor. I find myself wondering with horror what she felt, how she and Abraham spoke as they went into and departed from Egypt. It's not until Genesis 16 that we find Sarah showing up as an actor in the story. Sarah has continued to be barren. 10 years have passed. Sarah has grown impatient. Hope has been replaced by a fear of infertility. Sarah is driven by the thing she idolizes and desires above all else, which is to have a son. Though God has already promised an heir, Sarah doesn't trust these promises. What she has is her own power as a member of the dominant cultural group in her traveling village, the wife of the leader. So she decides to use her power to take matters into her own hands. Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. The servant is Hagar, an Egyptian slave girl. She is young. She has no financial security. She is far from home. She's a woman. She's an ethnic minority in this setting. Hagar to Sarah is not a person, but a possession to be used. Abram agrees to what Sarah says. And the scripture tells us after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her slave Hagar, gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Sarah, who's been offered as a sexual prize, her body traded for Abraham's safety, increasing Abraham's financial standing, Sarah offers Hagar as a sexual partner. Hagar's body traded for Sarah's desire for children. The objectified becomes the objectifier. Hagar becomes pregnant, and as her body grows with Abraham's coveted child, she acquires a kind of power over Sarah, the fertile woman, the carrier of Abraham's offspring. And she begins to despise her mistress. The next steps reveal that sin begets more sin. Sarah says to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between me and you." "Your slave is in your hands," Abraham says. "Do what you think best." So Sarah mistreated Hagar, and she fled. Sarah has not gotten what she expected, though she engineered the situation herself. Now she wants someone else to fix it. Hagar, thrust out into the desert, alone, without resources, encounters God. I wish I had time to talk about the incredible encounter between Hagar and the Lord. The Lord sees her. The Lord values her. The Lord names her. The Lord promises that he will protect her son Ishmael and her. And then in a crushing moment, returns her into this difficult cultural family situation. I want God to make a new home for her, to free her from bondage and sadness and objectification that are her daily world. But that's not what happens. 17, God meets with Abraham again to name for the third time the covenant promises. This time, for the first time, Sarah is named as part of the covenant. God gives her a new name, promises he will bless her, promises he will make her the mother of many nations. As we come to today's passage, I find it interesting that Sarah is not visible to us each time Abraham encounters God. In the covenant promises, she is invisible. In the conversations, she's hidden. Is she alongside Abraham? Is she hiding in the tent, listening to God's promises? Or is she off sleeping somewhere, unaware? Does she know God? Does she talk to God? Did she at some point trust God to keep these promises? Or for her, are they only Abraham's stories? In Genesis 18, Abraham is visited by the Lord as he sits outside his tent in the heat of the day. He receives 3 visitors. He knows that the Lord has come. He rushes to host them and asks Sarah and the servant to prepare food. Throughout a conversation between Abraham and the visitor, Sarah remains in the tent. Why? Is it just because she's preparing food? Is there a reason she doesn't want to see or be seen by the Lord? The visitor asks, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" He asks aloud where Sarah can hear him. Abraham responds that she's in the tent. No word, no appearance from Sarah. The visitor says aloud, "In a year I will return, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, hearing these words, laughs to herself in the tent. It's interesting to me that the writer, who leaves out so many details of Sarah's life, captures this laugh. You know, there are many kinds of laughs, and I picture Sarah's laugh as the laugh of a bitter woman. Not a laugh of amusement or of delight, but a cynical snort. I imagine her hope has been forfeited. She believes she's too old, nearly 90 now. She laughs because she doesn't believe her dream will be fulfilled any longer, doesn't think God will give her what she's already been promised. The Lord hears her laugh from outside the tent, challenges it, asking Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son.'" It seems to me that this is the moment Sarah perceives herself to be seen by the Lord. Somehow the interaction shifts, and it's between the Lord and Sarah, though we don't learn whether Sarah ever comes out of the tent. Sarah speaks up and says directly to the guest, "I did not laugh." She lies and denies the laugh because she's afraid. Why does she lie, even though it's been clear that she's been heard? Why is she afraid? What causes her to respond directly to the Lord for the first time in this story? The laugh has revealed her doubt in front of the Lord. The visitor, the Lord has confronted her disbelief, and she is no longer able to hide. Let's take a sober look at these people the Lord has chosen. Abraham promised that he would have land, be a great nation, have many offspring, have God's presence. Abraham, who holds cultural power of masculinity, wealth, and position, abuses his power to take control and relinquish responsibility. He forfeits its hope that God will protect him. He confuses his identity as a covenant partner with the Lord with the identity of one who must grab control. Lie. Sarah, who holds cultural power as the wife of the most powerful, wealthy leader in her dominant community, in her traveling village, fears being barren so much that she manipulates a vulnerable woman for the sake of fertility. She forfeits her hope that God will make a great nation from her union with Abraham. She's confused her identity as a covenant partner with an identity where her values based solely on her fertility and her ability to grab control. Their lack of faith and forfeited hope lead them to behave in ways that don't lead to blessing for others, but lead to curse. The good news is that God sees and hears Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael, and now Sarah. Forward to Genesis 21, 1 year later, Sarah is a mother at the age of 90. Now, Sarah's laugh is different. It's a laugh of gratitude, a laughter rooted in blessing and an acknowledgement of being seen and known. It's an open laughter. The laughter after Isaac's birth is a laughter that invites all to rejoice and receive blessing. I wish I could say that this story had a joyful ending. Sarah has cultivated a long jealousy and poisonous thoughts over many years towards Hagar and her son, Ishmael. Now that she has her own son, she takes control again, and with Abraham's permission, again thrusts Hagar and Ishmael out to fend for themselves in the desert. Traveling through another wealthy country, Abraham again says that Sarah is his sister. She is again taken into a household of another king, and God must act to show his displeasure. It's hard to imagine that these are the people with whom God will extend blessing to the world. The ripple effects of their lives have impact on pharaohs and kings who might have heard of the blessing of the Lord, have impact on Hagar and Ishmael who might have received the care of a godly community. God's covenant people are asked to live in a broken culture with promises that play out in God's time, facing fears and dangers with the trust that the Lord will be true. No small task. They fail again and again, and yet God continues to see them, meet them, bring grace and blessing. What does Sarah and Abraham's story have to say to us in this season? In mainstream evangelical American cultural tradition, so often the application of Scripture calls us to leave the conversation about systemic power and justice aside to focus on personal piety and self-improvement. I'm going to challenge us to straddle that gap today. There's a word here for those of us who hold cultural power, because we are the dominant cultural group. White women, white men, white people who hold wealth or positional authority. Like many of you over these past weeks, I have found myself disoriented at the heinous killing of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. Thinking about Christian Cooper, less than a mile from here, confronted simply by showing up black in the wrong place. As protests have rolled across the country, I found myself at times disoriented, tracking news, responding to new information, at times weary, sad, overwhelmed, at times grateful, hopeful that the protests might at last bring change. As with COVID, sometimes I have found myself forgetting for an hour or so what is happening, or wishing for relief and a return to normal. And I've thought about how that forgetting is the privilege of a white person. That very sense of normal to return to the privilege of the white person. My life is ordered, and I don't need to think about whether my son or father or husband will be unsafe when they encounter the police. I don't need to ask whether my child will be viewed as less smart in school or less likely to get a job because of the color of his skin. I don't need to wonder whether my family will be treated as lesser in hospital, courts of law, or neighborhoods. I have the luxury of living more like Sarah than Hagar. I have felt invited by the Spirit again and again to consider, how am I presuming upon the privileges of my whiteness to have these things without cost? As a kingdom person who professes to believe in justice and equality, how have I failed to order my priorities and actions to fit with my beliefs? One thing that's risen up for me, 30 years I've educated my children living in Jersey City. Jersey City had failing school systems when I arrived 30 years ago. I chose private education and worked hard to send my kids to a great school. They had music lessons, tutoring when they needed it. By high school, they had sufficient privilege to apply to and get into one of the few successful magnet schools in Jersey City, while most kids attended the 4 failing high schools. Over those years, I've had to check every time we vote to see if I could learn enough to even know who to vote for on the school board. I've not shown up at one city council meeting to protest education. While my children have had the privilege of being raised with financial support and care, I have let black and brown children near me receive an inadequate education and turned my head. The haunting question for me, the one that keeps slipping like a drop of water from under my thumb, is what do I fear or long for so much that I've been able to live this way? Am I too busy with my own agenda, my own commitment to succeed according to my terms? Too comfortable with what I have and unwilling to take on the weight of fighting an unfair system? Am I too fearful of what it will take to know what's happening in the schools in my own town, where my taxes pay for a largely substandard education? I follow the Jesus who's the one who is announced in the Magnificat. He fills up the hungry, lifts the humble, scatters the proud, confronts the rulers. The Jesus I follow came to earth and saw the unseen. He touches the poor, the lepers, the culturally invisible. The Jesus I follow tells stories of widows and orphans to make them visible, confronts those with cultural power of every sort. He leaves the 99 for the one. What if we lived as if our identity as Jesus followers means our job on earth is to see those who Jesus sees and to act as Jesus would act? What if we lived as if the safety, security, validity, and privilege of the systems we participate in are only to be enjoyed when they're available to all? White people, middle and upper class people, people who hold power or wealth, I invite you to hold these questions today. First, what hope have you forfeited or allowed to become a driver in your life, shaping your fear and controlling your choices and actions? Second, what is the cost of forfeited hope in your story? Who are the Hagars? Who are the Pharaohs who've been impacted by your actions? Where has your forfeited hope caused you to confuse your identity and created bitterness in you? Finally, where is the Lord inviting you to replace the jaded laughter of cynicism and doubt that belong to questioning God's promises in this time and place for the joyful laughter of new life, rooted in covenant promises, action, and dependence? Let's be silent for a moment and hold these things, and then I'll close this in prayer. Lord, we long to live and act and speak as covenant daughters and sons. Pull back the blinders from our eyes and help us to see what you see. Shape our identity that we might reflect first your kingdom promises as we live in the world. Amen.